Speaking of Pianists by Abram Chasins. Published by Alfred A. Knopf, New York, 1957. Narrated by Penny Johnson. To my teachers and my pupils, who made me aware of everything I hold most dear. Acknowledgements. First, my profound, though not unmixed thanks go to Irving Culloden of the Saturday Review, whose encouraging editorial invitations plunged me into the swirling waters of criticism. I am indebted to that magazine for permission to draw upon material first published in its pages. To Columbia Records and RCA Victor for similar generosity, and to Elliot M. Sanger of WQXR for his kindly patience with a music director who would write a book. To Doré Smedley, I am grateful for arming me with the sober facts of a book writer's life, and for showing me trade tricks with manila envelopes, scissors, and paste. To Thomas Lask of the New York Times, and to Wills Hollingsworth of WQXR, for their unflinching hospitality whenever I charged their desks with questions regarding what may humorously be called my syntax. To Miriam Molen for painstaking preparation of the index. To Paul Hirschman for proffering helpful advice and for reading proofs, and to my editor, Herbert Weinstock, whose adamant demands somehow always managed to sound like friendly, casual suggestions. My deepest thanks I owe to my wife, whose forbearance and helpfulness prevailed throughout writing periods that often uprooted her professional and personal life. Abram Chasins. Speaking of Pianists. Introduction. In this book, I have set down a variety of recollections and impressions related to a part of my pianistic life, that part which I lived as a student, listener, and observer rather than as a concert pianist. I invite the reader to share with me some of the experiences, some of the sounds and ideas gathered during 50 years of association with the piano, much of its literature, and many of its players. I do not promise that other matters will not creep into these pages. The piano is a rich subject for illustrating many elements of music, even of life itself, and I have often been unable to resist its suggestiveness. Yet, essentially, this is a series of reminiscences relevant to piano playing and piano music, reactions stimulated by personal associations, by performances on and off the platform, and by recordings. Although the history of music exists in composition, the life of music exists in performance, actual or recorded, constructed as in score reading, or reconstructed in the mind. From time to time, I shall pause to comment on things heard and heard about, on past and present ideals and practices, on things I love and loathe. The reader and I may not always agree. Happily, that is our aesthetic as well as our democratic right. Should this book prove at all provocative to those whose lives are enriched by music, it will modify some of the misgivings I hold about my ability to put into words anything so intangible and intricate as musical reaction, not to mention the electrifying fusion of genius and knowledge. My own taste and opinions stem from standards and principles learned from artists I had the privilege of calling master and friend. They who personified artistic standards so convincingly should actually have written this book. Of course, in many ways they have, a good deal of it. But perhaps they would have needed another lifetime to formulate and set down what it took each of them one lifetime to achieve. It was they who persuaded me and substantiated in their art that the laws of beauty have an inexorable logic. Their precepts and practices are the main sources of my feeling about the piano and its literature, inescapably woven into the texture and fabric of my entire musical outlook. In the hope that the reader will care to come along with me and to hear for himself some of the things I heard, I should like to begin by having him meet Joseph Hoffmann. Exposition. Joseph Hoffmann. It was an abnormally hot afternoon in the spring of 1926 when I found myself at the door of Joseph Hoffmann's suite at the Great Northern Hotel in Manhattan. I waited for quite a few minutes before knocking, hoping that my heart would stop pounding. Hoffmann had been my pianistic idol for many of my 22 years, but I had never come closer to him than the distance between the top balcony and the stage of Carnegie Hall. And here I was, paying him a visit at his invitation. It had all come about 2 weeks before, when I had met Mrs. Hoffmann and had been astonished to hear her say, "Joseph's been told about your Chinese pieces. He'd like to hear them and anything else you'd like to play for him. We're coming in from Philadelphia for a few days before we sail for Europe. We'll be at the Great Northern. Will you come?" Would I? My first jolt that afternoon came when Hoffmann himself answered my knock, and I, all 5'6" of me, had to lower my gaze several inches to meet his squarely. The contrast between the mild-mannered little man who greeted me and the mental image I had held of him was startling. It was hard to reconcile the soft voice, delicate features, small hands, and meticulously debonair dress with the relentless Titan of the keyboard. The only physical sign of his power was in his massive back and shoulders. He looked like a chunky quarterback who moved with the litheness of a dancer. At that time, Hoffmann had just turned 50, but looked ageless. He could just as well have been 40 or 60. While we talked, I observed the impeccable neatness of the man and the orderliness of his simple hotel parlor. An immaculately dusted Steinway Grand stood in the corner, its keys gleaming, but with not a single piece of music on it, just a lone and shining metronome. Hoffmann asked me about my piano studies, theoretical training, and compositional work. His questions were pointed and precise. He never wasted a syllable. He spoke flawless English with a slight accent, origin untraceable. I later learned that he was equally at home in German, French, and, naturally, his native Polish. In the first few minutes of conversation, he revealed a rigidly disciplined mind, an intense concentration, and a fierce passion for separating opinion from fact, truth from half-truth. He also had a quick sense of humor. Finally, gesturing with an economical wave toward the piano, he said, "Please." First I played my 3 Chinese pieces. "Very effective. I'll play them," he said. Then I played Chopin's F-sharp minor nocturne. He said. "And now?" A group of Chopin's preludes. "And now?" The first movement of Beethoven's Waldstein Sonata. Something else." "Mr. Hoffmann," I said, "I know your time is limited. Would you please tell me what you think?" Everything about that afternoon remains indelibly in my memory, but most of all I remember the things that Hoffmann said at that point. He still spoke very quietly, but grew unexpectedly tense and voluble. Drawing his head back and tilting it to one side as his penetrating gray eyes appraised me, he said, "You see, there is no question of your talent. The question is what has been done with your talent. For example, you have feeling, but it does not emerge fully. You have a sensitive ear, but it is an inner ear which hears more what you want to produce than what you are actually producing. You have mechanical facility, which is not yet elevated into an integrated and expressive technique, a warm tonal equipment, which is not emotionally significant, a rhythm, basically good, but one which does not set nor sustain a basic pulsation, and so on. What you do not have is the knowledge, even an awareness of vital principles of music and pianism. You do not have the standards with which to judge, to refine, to correct your playing. Now, let's go back to the music. Start the nocturne again, and I'll try to be more specific, all right? After 8 bars, he stopped me. I'm sure, he said, you don't realize that you have not yet established any fundamental rhythmic premise. Isn't the tempo right? I'm not talking about tempo, but about basic pace, he answered. First, I don't know what your tempo is, because no 2 bars are alike. Second, there is no such absolute as the right tempo. We ourselves set a tempo as we start to play. If it destroys the general spirit or mood, it is a wrong tempo. If it enables us to realize the mood we want to express, it is a right tempo, not the right one, and we can work within it. From then on, the emotional, harmonic, and dramatic development of the composition leads us to vary our pace. But first, we must establish a norm from which we can depart and to which we can return. Rhythm is order, he continued, adjusting the metronome slightly, not the order that moves with cosmic precision, but that of humanity with all its mercurial emotions. Within us is a flexible human metronome, the heart. It is regulated by an educated taste. He paused for breath. Now, try to get a presiding pace, and let's go on. He did not stop me again. When I finished, he said, You have learned something. This time you established a recognizable tempo and generally maintained its basic momentum within freedoms. But you cannot imagine how much your freedoms distort the music you play. Let's take only one aspect of your playing. You constantly violate the principle of motion and rest. When the melodic line reaches a point of rest, you always rush the accompaniment to fill the vacuum until the melody again moves, utterly destroying its repose and design. Also, every new theme, every alteration of dynamics takes some toll in a departure from your previous tempo. Further, in an effort to become expressive, you employ sentimental delays or crude picture postcard coloration completely out of the scheme you yourself devised. Your freedom is license, not liberty. Real freedom comes from discipline, from feeling that has been cultivated by knowledge. The validity of interpretation depends on inexorably logical relationships. At this moment, you do not have an apparatus for solving your problems. It is not that you lack either the talent or the skill to master, for instance, rhythmic liberty within a sustained momentum. It is merely that you do not demand it of yourself, because it is not part of your ideology, nor will it be until you acquire the refinement to make such subtle precision an ideal. That is what Hoffman said, and the way he said it. I typed it word for word as soon as I got home. The meticulously chosen vocabulary, the balanced phrases fascinated me almost as much as what he said. Oh, one more thing I'd like you to think about, he continued. Constantly, your attempts to attain an expressive serenity are defeated. I'll tell you why. You establish a calm, then you begin to hear that your playing is growing colorless and dull. Something's wrong, but you don't know what it is or what's causing it. So you try for expressivity by turning pulsation and coloration on and off like a faucet. Your expression, now consists of a series of restless and unexpected little fits and starts. Goodbye to all repose. 2 hours earlier, I had walked into this room as a young pianist on the brink of a career, one who had been encouraged by many eminent musicians to make a New York debut long before this day. Now I felt that I knew nothing about piano playing. I had finally encountered standards, Olympian standards, and a conception of music and performance which had never before touched me at all. How was this possible? Had I not heard Hoffmann and other giants countless times and recognized in their art the embodiment of all my ideals? It gradually dawned on me that I had not heard them at all, that I had been luxuriating in a formless sea of sound in a semi-hypnotic state. I did not know what I was hearing. I had no idea what, besides genius, produced great interpretation. Never had it occurred to me that there were basic principles behind such an art, or that they could be formulated and analyzed and understood. My head swam. In a voice that was sympathetic but icily objective, Hoffmann brought me back with a characteristic, "There are a few things you have to learn, quite a few things, and they would make a vast difference to your playing, to your entire life in music. I think I might be able to help you with some of them. Betty and I are sailing next week to Europe for 3 or 4 months. If you would like to go abroad and do some work with me, I shall arrange it." Would I? That is when and how a 30-year association began with a master and a friend who will live within me until I no longer draw breath. It would be difficult to exaggerate the benevolence and integrity of my first piano teachers, Bertha Firing Tapper, Richard Epstein, and Ernest Hutchison. I owe them all incalculable gratitude. They led me in a succession of valuable lessons to control my fingers, to acquire a large and significant repertoire, and to hold a serious attitude toward a musician's obligations. I had further opportunities to be helped and inspired through association with many other remarkable musicians who were not my teachers, but nonetheless showed generous interest in my studies. Yet from my first 2-hour lesson with Hoffmann in London, I learned more than during my entire previous experience. Each comment let in a new flood of light. His method was the sustained attempt to show each work as an entity, a coherent consistency, and to observe its connections and relationships. He would exemplify the fluidity and flexibility of interpretation by demonstrating several different conceptions deriving from contrasting premises, and make each one valid and convincing. He compelled me to know at every moment where I was, where I had come from, and where I was going, and to articulate my intentions. I was always in the midst of an exciting search for melodic, harmonic, and structural significance. I came to feel as though I had been living my musical life under a perpetually gray sky. With every word or gesture, every literary or human or pianistic illustration, Hoffmann dispersed another cluster of clouds. The sky gradually cleared. On occasion, the sun even burst forth when I did well, and he would smile. Plowing right through my rock-ribbed habits, he would stop me to ask, "What elements go into differentiating one compositional style from another? What can make one passage played slower than another sound actually faster? What factors make a tone or chord sound ugly or beautiful played at the identical intensity?" As soon as one answered, he would say, "Demonstrate it." Mechanical difficulties were your problems, not his, but he helped greatly by illustration, by revealing an idealized oral image of a passage or a piece. There it was in all its perfection. Somehow it released you from minor tensions and muscular preoccupations. You had the sound, the objective, before you. Hearing the total effect, you found it more easily accomplishable. It was as though he had waved a magic wand that enabled you to do more than you could do. At other times he hammered away by applying principles to ordinary experience. For example, discussing the problem of projection, he once said, "If someone entered this room and you spoke to him in a normal conversational tone, he would hear you easily. If you used the same tone from the stage of a theater, the people in the fourth row would ask, 'What's that? What's he saying?' Public communication necessitates heightened projection. Otherwise we are talking or playing to ourselves. And it is a far larger problem than one of amplified volume. It embraces our choice of tempi, textures, and architectures, the degree and kinds of accentuation and pedaling we can use, the variety and proportion of agogic and dynamic effects we make, and much more. Remember, we are playing to express ourselves through the music we play, but we are expressing ourselves to others." Hoffmann was entirely persuasive, especially because he was as inflexible about primary principles as he was elastic in their application. He was untiring in pointing out the many roads that lead to Rome. "A work of art is large enough," he said, "to hold innumerable and contrasting interpretations without losing an iota of its inherent truth." The exciting lessons continued for 4 months in Berlin, in Paris, and back again in London. Despite the newness of my surroundings and the difficulty of wrestling with strange languages, I worked hard and began to gain feelings of purpose and possibility, of confidence based upon conviction. During this period, Hoffmann also revealed many of his human traits. Once, while riding in a train to Berlin, I turned to say something to him. He put a restraining hand and shook his head from side to side. "Excuse me," he said, with eyes closed. "I'm practicing." Through the years, I saw him hundreds of times in the midst of mental practice, which he held to be invaluable because it freed the performer from instrumental considerations. He rarely stopped thinking or hearing music, except when he played tennis or poker or chess. His surest escape was an all-night session in his tool shop, surrounded by his beloved precision instruments and implements. Hoffmann had a penchant for Abdullah cigarettes, an expensive, pungent Turkish blend which he always smoked through a long, thin holder. When he opened a new box, he would meticulously cut each cigarette in half with a small scissors, loftily proclaiming that nobody ever smoked a whole cigarette anyway. He adored fine food, and I was a frequent and appreciative guest as the Hoffmanns and their friends sampled the great restaurants of the cities we visited. With a good wine within reach and a gourmet's repast under his belt, Hoffmann grew warm and expansive. He told marvelous stories and was an excellent listener to the stories of others, which he carefully preserved in a little black book used for nothing else. Amid the delightful interludes, slavish work went on. Hoffmann practiced, performed, and allotted a generous portion of his free time to teaching me. I was driven by his urgency for precision and coherence, his ceaseless quest to investigate and to solve artistic problems whole, to radiate every solution outward toward a more vital realization of music, and even toward a greater understanding of life itself. As for pianism, the model was before me daily. In full view was a master who conceived ideals of harmonious magnificence, who molded and fashioned them and set them forth in beauty and perfection. Although the mass public took its sweet time in granting sovereignty to the Hoffmann who was no longer a wunderkind, there was evidently no time when he was not the pianist's pianist. During my first visit to London, The ever-gracious William Steinway was showing me various concert pianos at his company's headquarters. He mentioned that the young Russian wizard Vladimir Horowitz had been there the day before, picking out a piano for his forthcoming appearance. "And what is that piano in the corner?" Horowitz asked. "That's Hoffman's piano," Steinway answered. "Joseph Hoffman's own piano?" asked Horowitz in an awed voice. He hesitated and then said, "Please, may I just touch it?" Long before we met and became friends, that incident endeared Horowitz to me. Some years later, at one of Hoffman's memorable recitals in New York's Carnegie Hall, following a truly bedazzling performance of Chopin's B minor sonata, Sergei Rachmaninoff sat silent for a few moments and then said, "Well, there goes one more composition out of my repertoire. Not since Anton Rubinstein have I heard anything like this. There's no use. It is the music itself, and the only way to play it, and nobody else can do it." Another vivid recollection is a story Leopold Godowsky told me. Every pianist knows Godowsky's fanciful and formidable transcription of Johann Strauss's Künstlerleben. Few have ever conquered its terrifying complexities. Godowsky related that when the piece had just been completed and was still in manuscript, he played it to Hoffmann, who seemed delighted by it. Hoffmann asked to hear it again immediately. After dinner, he again requested Godowsky to play the fascinating piece. A few days later, Hoffmann returned. "He sat down," reported Godowsky, "and played my piece through with such unbelievable infallibility that I ran to see if my manuscript was still in the house. It was, of course. Joseph had actually memorized it after hearing it only 3 times. After that, I just listened, forgetting the fantastic feat in the intoxication of his playing." From the time when he was 6, when he electrified an audience at a recital in his native Poland, Hoffmann was one of the wonders of the musical world. At 10, he astounded Berlin playing the Beethoven First Concerto under Hans von Bülow. Following a sensational tour of Europe, Hoffmann's father brought the 11-year-old prodigy to the United States. His debut here took place in November 1887, and many who were present have reported that no subsequent event in their musical experience ever matched the thrill of seeing the diminutive figure in a white sailor suit come out on the huge stage of the Metropolitan Opera House and proceed to play like an angel pursued by the devil. When he finished playing, the audience broke into a wild demonstration, screaming, applauding, dabbing at tear-filled eyes. W. J. Henderson, the most distinguished critic of the day, called the boy a miracle. A triumphal tour of over 50 concerts followed. The itinerary came to an abrupt end when the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children stepped in to halt what they termed exploitation. At this point, the American millionaire Alfred C. Clark offered Hoffmann's father $50,000, a far greater sum then than now, to further the boy's education on condition that he be withdrawn from the platform until he reached 18. The offer was accepted, and Hoffmann went back to Europe to study first under Moritz Moszkowski and then for 2 years with Anton Rubinstein. Rubinstein's playing and tutelage made a monumental impression on Hoffmann. Once when I tried to express to Hoffmann the overpowering drama and vastness of his playing of Beethoven's Opus 111, he looked at me pityingly and said, "I'm very sorry for you that you never heard my master. Why, I'm a child. All of us put together are infants compared to his titanic force." On one occasion, I attended a Hoffmann recital with Misha Levitsky. Both of us were stunned by his reading of Schumann's C major fantasy. Knowing that Hoffmann shared my admiration for Levitsky's beautiful pianism, I ventured to tell Hoffmann how we felt. Hoffmann looked at us and said, "You know, I played that work for Anton Rubinstein when I was 16 or 17. When my lesson was over, Rubinstein said to me, "My boy, you play this work quite perfectly, but you won't know much about it for 20 years. Hoffman stopped a moment and then said, "It's now over 30 years, and I know that there are worlds in it I haven't begun to explore." It is only from Hoffman himself that we have learned how much Rubinstein contributed toward bringing his gifts to their fullest fruition. For to the world, Rubinstein declared that music had never seen the equal of this boy's genius. At 18, with his master's approval, Hoffman set out to tour again throughout Europe and America. In Russia particularly, he was very shortly an object of worship. St. Petersburg witnessed 19 of his appearances during one season, appearances for which every seat was sold before the first note of the first concert had been played. Through the long, bitter nights preceding each event, lines of students waited in the cold to buy standing room. Many of them were undoubtedly among the frenzied enthusiasts who later carried their idol on their shoulders after the performances. Recognition came less swiftly in America. The cognoscenti knew Hoffman's greatness. The public took longer to recognize it. Hoffman once mentioned that his withdrawal from the stage had some very costly aspects. Not only had he to reacquire the platform ease that had been natural to his childhood, but also he found that it was not easy to re-interest our general public in the solid achievements of a mature artist who had once been a sensational prodigy. Eventually, of course, and without the ballyhoo of publicity, which Hoffman always abhorred, genius triumphed. Critics strained at their adjectives, and the public battled for admission to performances that provided never-to-be-forgotten interpretations. Those who heard Hoffman in the Chopin concertos, the Schumann concerto, the Beethoven Third, Fourth, and Fifth, and the Rubinstein concertos will carry uniquely inspiring remembrances with them forever. So will those who heard from him the Chopin and Schumann sonatas, the Beethoven Pathetique, Moonlight, Waldstein, Appassionata, and Opus 111, the Handel Brahms variations, Schumann's Carnaval and symphonic etudes, and countless other works, large and small. I always considered myself fortunate that I heard Hoffman for the first time when I was already in my early teens, just old enough to have studied some of the works he played, to have heard many compositions on his programs performed by others, and to have acquired a certain basis for evaluation. Standards in those days were of no mean order, for it was an opulent period of great pianists. Once having heard Hoffman, however, I felt about him as he felt about Anton Rubinstein. By the time I came to that realization, he was already conceded all over the world to be a pianist in that royal line tracing from Liszt. The public always has cause to be grateful to artists of special distinction and integrity. To some we are indebted for stylistic perfection or technical virtuosity of a musicianly order, to others for nobility of melodic expression or imaginative coloring. In Hoffman, every quality was blended. He had superlative restraint and also unconstrained impetuosity, a touch that ranged from icy cold to burning hot, unlimited shades of color that came from changes of tone quality or alterations of balance rather than from an increase or decrease of volume. A rhythm that varied from metronomic to rhapsodic without any loss of the basic pulsation. He was the dramatic orchestrator of the piano whose playing evoked the forces of nature and of humanity. Hoffman had practically no mannerisms of facial expression or physical motion. It was not that he was unaware of their effects. He was merely sparing in their use. When he deviated from his usual composure, it was most often to create an optical impression calculated to enhance some breathtaking oral surprise that he had in store for us. I have never seen him indulge in theatrics that did not have the specific purpose of intensifying some dramatic musical idea. Otherwise, his face and body remained almost motionless. He used to say, "Create excitement in others through your understanding and memory of excitement. If you yourself become agitated, you become less able to communicate excitement." Hoffmann rarely demanded of the instrument more than it had to give, but occasionally, in an emotional outburst at a climactic point, he would forget his own precepts, lift his left hand high, then slam it down to smite the bass a mighty blow with his open palm. At times like that, a sound not unlike the roar of an enraged lion would emerge from the piano. Hoffmann played like one who himself is creating right there at that very moment. Actually, he was, for he never played any work the same way twice. The music poured out as an improvisation that gushed from his inner being. When he played familiar works, he lavished upon them so rich an imagination, so original a conception, that one had the impression of hearing the music for the very first time. His greatest colleagues, even Rachmaninoff, who had his own magic power to take us to the mountaintops, to imbue us with a sense of prophecy and fulfillment, placed Hoffmann alone on the highest peak, the absolute monarch of the pianistic realm. It is less generally known that Hoffmann composed a symphony and several piano concertos and solos under the nom de plume of Dvorsky. Perhaps it is even less known that he invented shock absorbers, air springs, and other automobile appliances used on standard cars. The same brain applied itself to the pursuit of beauty through observation and codification of aesthetic and physical principles. He then related and applied his findings, seeking every conceivable possibility of utilizing them to attain clearer communication, greater expressivity in his playing. He used his understanding of acoustical phenomena to play a passage more slowly than anyone else and make it sound much faster, to play a chord with half the force of another and have it emerge with twice the sonority. Each pedal was used in a dozen positions between the down or up employed by most pianists. He demonstrated time and time again that in the art of interpretation there are no absolutes. He would enunciate a theory and then sit down at the piano to illustrate it. The sounds themselves were unforgettable inspirations, and just as one had concluded that this was the way, the only way, he would turn everything upside down and prove that way equally valid. In the realm of his art, imagination had full sway. In the realm of facts, he was a precisionist. The scientist in him sought to remove all discrepancies. The artist in him capitalized on them. His unlimited resources included the constant demonstration that brilliance results from clarity, not from speed. That virtuosity, when it does not abuse its function, is actually the dramatization of velocity through rhythmic accentuation and variety of color. His knowledge of muscular activity was of medical caliber, and he knew the mechanism of the piano more precisely than most professional regulators. One of the most revealing lessons with my master took place a few days after a recital in which he played the Appassionata. Never had I heard, even from him, such controlled accuracy maintained through a spirit of seemingly heedless recklessness. It was as though a storm was driving straight through the heavens. Arriving for my next lesson, I asked Hoffmann to admit that this was an inspirational achievement arising from subconscious and autonomous sources, and that it defied analysis. Without answering, he went to the piano. Illustrating with snatches from the sonata, he showed me the premises of his architecture, demonstrating how the minutest deviation from the established tempos, dynamics, and moods could have ruined the scheme. He had known exactly what he was doing. He talked in terms of the degree of arm and finger weight used to attain desired textures, the speed of rebound of key and hammer, The modification of tone colors by judicious use of the pedals, the essential elements of Beethoven's dramatic style. Suddenly he stopped and rose from the instrument. "As for the rest," he said, "some of it may be impossible to teach, but lots of it can be learned if the imagination is properly educated and stimulated." Somehow, that afternoon, something I had always felt was suddenly clarified, that genius starts out with a vision of remote beauty, which is then subject to refinement, just as refinement can be brought to a lower order of talent, which occasionally may yield superior accomplishment, but inescapably falls short of genius. In Joseph Hoffmann, instrumental virtuosity, artistic vision, and scientific pursuit combined to draw from the piano a particular magic no other artist could summon. It was in tribute to this artist that a brilliant audience at the Metropolitan Opera House on November 28, 1937, rose to its feet as he reappeared on the very stage where he had made his historic debut 50 years before. The nature of the occasion virtually dictated the program. It was eminently right for Hoffmann to play the concerto of his master, Rubinstein, a composition of his own, Chromaticon for piano and orchestra, a group of Chopin solos long identified with his career, and encores of audience favorites. Nevertheless, this was no concert redolent of lavender and old lace. The mood had been set by a vital performance of Brahms's Academic Festival Overture by the Curtis Institute Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Fritz Reiner. Thus Hoffmann shared the memorable evening with students of the famous school he directed, and with a fellow member of the Institute's faculty. The event was electric with the blithe spirit of youth and the golden glow of tradition. It was a matter of chance that records came to be made of the concert. Mrs. Hoffmann thought that some memento should be made of this touching occasion in Joseph's life. She asked a friend as a personal favor to bring some recording equipment to the opera house. Tape machines and LP techniques were not in existence in those days. The friend brought one of those portable sets ordinarily used to make records of family celebrations and other such informal affairs in the home. A microphone was placed on the huge Metropolitan Opera House stage at a convenient, though not particularly advantageous, spot. Mrs. Hoffmann had no idea of making the records available except for Joseph's personal use. The discs themselves were used and abused for a decade and lent to friends, some of whom carelessly used dull needles or played the records on machines out of repair. Almost 20 years passed before officials of Columbia Records learned of the existence of these records. They diligently tracked down each record and then used all of their persuasive powers to gain Hoffmann's permission to issue them. It was a long struggle. Finally, he agreed. They salvaged the most usable of the collection and with unusual skill transferred them to an LP record. The disc contains 10 of the solos performed at that historic concert. The piano with orchestra works were evidently too far gone or unobtainable. Therefore, with the exceptions of Chopin's First Ballade and the Andante Spianato and Grande Polonaise, it is the exquisitely wrought art of Hoffmann in the smaller frames which we have here. It is the art of variety within unity, of subtle and disciplined gradation, of imagination overflowing with invention, of freedom guided by precision. Still, it is no document of Hoffmann at his greatest, and the admission only underlines the extent of his art at its height and fully explains his reluctance to permit its publication. Shortly after Hoffmann's death, an outfit called Allegro issued a disc compiled from Hoffmann's 1939-40 radio appearances. It stands as an ear witness to the last tragic years, as a tasteless disservice to the memory of a master whose mastery had turned to ashes. Perhaps some isolated, More worthily representative recordings may crop out here or there, but at the moment the Hoffman discography consists of the Jubilee disc. The absence of others has been properly lamented, but explained as largely Hoffman's fault. I do not think so. At any rate, it is at least a moot point. Here are the ramifications as I know them, and the reader may judge for himself. During most of the years of Hoffman's greatest period, circa 1905 to 32, Europe was the origin of the significant piano recordings of the large-form works, and such European favorites as Bachhaus, Schnabel, and Rubinstein supplied the bulk of the playing. Hoffman's career had firmly become all-American, and our recording companies were concentrating on small works that could be heard in their entirety on one side of a 78 RPM disc. Evidently they had gauged the public taste perfectly, for they made fortunes on a literature of encore-size pieces, and so did the artists who performed them: Caruso, Kreisler, Elman, Heifetz, Alma Gluck, McCormack, and Paderewski. Hoffman told me that he was reluctant to be represented only by small works. His suggestions that he record larger works were unenthusiastically received. He was also naively surprised to sense some resistance to his demand for absolute veto. Everyone knew of Hoffman's dedication to artistic and technical perfection. The recording executives were undeniably right to envision the possibility of a week of solid work and costs to obtain one Chopin ballade that Hoffman might grudgingly admit was not too terrible. He also held stubbornly to the conviction that recordings adversely affected box office, and therefore he insisted on royalties that were higher than usual. This undoubtedly posed grave problems to a company faced with an artist who not only demanded more money, but also insisted on performing a repertoire that was expensive to produce and promised small sales. Hoffman never told me what he actually asked. I therefore cannot judge whether or not his terms were exorbitant. But I do know from his personal disappointment and his bitterness on the subject that persuading Hoffman to record was not impossible. It seems to me that had the guiding lights of the recording companies of those days fully understood what Hoffman represented to the history of piano playing, nothing would have stood in the way of perpetuating his playing. That had he asked for the moon, they would have made every effort to get it for him. It is tragic that they did not weigh the consequences, weigh small financial returns or no returns against the artistic returns, in order not to leave posterity almost bereft of examples of his unique art. While probing the possibilities of working out some long-term project, Hoffman did make several experimental discs. The playing reflected his apprehensions. The acoustic shellacs caught very little of his inimitably subtle and colorful art. That was another reason why he became difficult. Examples of Hoffman's playing in large-form works are therefore unavailable except to those who carry them as ineradicable memories, and so the Golden Jubilee disc must serve to fill a gaping void in the consecutive history of piano playing. It features 6 Chopin solos, Rachmaninoff's G minor prelude, Moszkowski's Spanish Caprice, Mendelssohn's Spinning Song, and Beethoven's Turkish March. Hoffman's art was the adventure of technical perfection and imaginative insight among the emotions. It recalls the truth that art begins where technique ends. This has never meant that an expressive art ignores technique, but rather that it experiences and then transcends all the disciplines of technique to attain complete emotional freedom and communicative power. Every Hoffman performance furnishes ample material for a treatise on the art of pianism and interpretation. The sensitive listener will relish finger passages that emerge as perfectly graded necklaces of jewels, as in the Chopin Berceuse and D-flat Waltz, and in the Spinning Song, the rhetorical eloquence of the Chopin Nocturne and Andante Spianato, and the improvisational opening of the ballade before the legend begins. The matchless elegance of the embellishments in the berceuse and the polonaise, and the nobility of the latter. Hoffmann's art utilized every element, alchemized into pure emotion, and amalgamated by a regal rhythm. He used to say, "An aristocrat never hurries." Obviously, the discs themselves cannot claim the characteristics of modern recordings. If that matters importantly to anyone, he certainly will not know what I have been talking about. All others will lend appreciative ears to the unique sounds, recognizing them as treasures from a virtually extinct art which enable the living present to observe a mighty past. Hoffmann was my primary link to that past, and my association with him continued fairly steadily until 1942. After that, he became a confirmed Californian and a virtual recluse. The last time I heard him was in 1939 on a broadcast. It brought me such anguish that I resolved never to hear him again. But we corresponded up to the last. His carefully handwritten letters were full of ironic humor, full of violent and unprintable comments on piano performances and recordings he was hearing over the radio. Almost every sentence had the bitter-sweet flavor of the past in a direct or oblique reference to the present. "I heard," he once wrote, "your friend, no longer mine, interpret the Chopin E minor concerto over the radio recently. Later, your friend, and always mine, Sasha Greiner of Steinway, informed me that a beautiful new 3-year-old piano had been abused. Were a certain society tuned in, the alleged artist would surely be imprisoned for cruelty to children." On another occasion, Hoffmann wrote, "I have a new little 16-foot boat. It is a peach. I gave her the very modest name of Majestic. From this, you will gather that by now I am fully artisticalized, modern style." Whatever documentation and remembrances remain of Hoffmann's unmodern artistry lead to the realization that when Joseph Hoffmann died, an era died.